Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I'm in the midst of answering some of your requests to do some videos on some given topics. Let me say again how important it is to understand that many of the requests that I have received are so interrelated so that to answer one is to answer all. For instance, one of the requests is to deal with what about the mark of the beast? What about 666? Well, guess what? To answer that question, I dealt with the issue, is Donald Trump the man of sin? Because you see, the man of sin and the Antichrist, the beast, they're the same. So if Donald Trump is not the man of sin, guess what? Then he's not going to impose the mark of the beast. It's that simple. Once again, all of these topics are so interrelated that, let me reiterate, to answer one and to demonstrate that one of these topics was fulfilled in the first century. For instance, the man of sin was alive in the first century. The restrainer was already restraining him in the first century. He was already sitting in the temple of God in the first century. Then that means, guess what? That means the mark of the beast was in the first century. That means, pardon me, that means that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. Well, that's what Jesus said. Matthew 24, 21 through 34. And so it is so critically important to understand that to address one of these issues is to, in truth, answer all of them. Now watch this. I mentioned to you yesterday that it would not matter if the Temple Institute in Jerusalem were to build another Ark of the Covenant, which I am told they are in the midst of preparing for. They've got all the materials, they've got it ready to rebuild. And I say this with all kindness, with all respect that is due. It absolutely would not matter if they built 1 or 10 or 100 boxes and called it the Ark of the Covenant. According to Jeremiah 3:16, which I have shared with you now, and something in my eye this morning will not let me alone. But according to Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 16, the Ark of the Covenant was destroyed and will never be built again. That is utterly devastating to the dispensational view. It cannot be avoided. And then I mentioned to you yesterday that even if they did build another box and they called it the Ark of the Covenant, it would not be important. Now they can call it the Ark, it doesn't make it the Ark. Because remember, the original Ark was destroyed. All right? Now then, watch this. Jeremiah chapter 3 says they would not only not go to Jerusalem to visit the Ark anymore, but he says it would not be brought to mind. Now, what does that mean? Do you remember? Does it mean that every human being on the face of the earth, does it mean that every Jew on the face of the earth, that God would suddenly, take his hand and wipe out any memory of the Ark of the Covenant? No, doesn't mean that. And that point is proven by the next statement. Neither shall it be remembered any more. Now, here's what we have to know about that little word remembered. Hebrew word zakar. The word remembered is not a word, although it can be used in this sense, but it is a word that carries with it, in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, carries with it covenantal connotations and denotations. God made a covenant with Abraham. And throughout the Old Testament, we are told God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Remembered. Well, it wasn't as if God said, yeah, I made a covenant with Abraham. No. The knowledge of that covenant was always there. But when God remembered the covenant, He was about to bring to bear, to bring to fulfillment the provisions of that covenant. To remember someone in a covenantal context meant that you were going to provide them the blessings of that covenant as a result of their obedience, or you were going to bring to bear the covenantal curses of that covenant as a result of their disobedience. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel prays to God because he understands that the 70 weeks foretold by Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 10, of the 70-year captivity was just about up. And he prayed to God to remember His covenant, to remember the promises that He had made. He acknowledged that Israel had violated the covenant, but he was now repenting of those sins and asking God to remember the covenant and to keep His promise and to restore them. Covenantal remembrance. We find this same word in Isaiah chapter 65, when God says, "Behold, I create a new heaven and the new earth, and the first heaven and earth shall not be remembered." Once again, it doesn't mean that God was going to simply wipe away the literal remembrance in a brain. No, the covenant of that prior creation, the covenant that identified that prior creation, would be removed. You know what that suggests in Jeremiah 3:16? It says that the Ark of the Covenant would lose its covenantal significance. What? What was in the Ark of the Covenant? 10 Commandments, which was the covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. The 10 Commandments were God's covenant with Israel. But here, Jeremiah chapter 3, God said the time was going to come in which that Ark of the Covenant, containing God's covenant with Israel, would be destroyed and never remembered again. And by the way, if you want a devastating concept in refutation of Sabbatarianism, right there it is. The Ark of the Covenant contained the 10 Commandments, in which was the Sabbath command. And the Sabbath was given to Israel as a sign of her deliverance from Egypt. But God said the time was going to come in which that Ark of the Covenant, God's covenant with Israel, inclusive of the Sabbath, would no longer be remembered. So folks, when people talk about a restored temple, a restored priesthood, a restored altar, a restored sacrificial cultus, at the heart and the core of that is the covenant. And nothing epitomized the covenant more than the Ark of the Covenant. And God said, the Ark of the Covenant, when the Messianic kingdom of heaven was established, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Old Covenant, the Ark of the Covenant between God and Israel, would no longer be remembered. God's covenant with Israel would be finally fulfilled, completely fulfilled, in the arrival of the everlasting kingdom of Jesus. That kingdom that was being delivered and received in the first century It's not yet future. We're not waiting for the discovery or the rebuilding of the Ark of the Covenant. That covenant that gave that ark its only significance has been fulfilled. And all of the types and all of the shadows of that old covenant have been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He is the reality. He is the new covenant. He is our dwelling place. Well, I'm going to let this suffice for our study of the Ark of the Covenant. Thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We'll have more on a slightly different topic in the morning, so we'll see you on the flip side.